everyone in London knew two things about the Duke of Ashford. The first, he had never smiled in public. Not at balls, not at Parliament, not even at the King's table. Men who had known him for 20 years said his face was carved from the same stone as his estate, beautiful, cold, and entirely unmoved by the people who stood before it. The second, the last woman who had tried to soften him had arrived at Ashford Estate in the full bloom of hope and left 3 days later with red eyes and nothing to say. She never spoke of what happened inside those walls. No one asked twice. Clara Voss knew both of these things. She had heard them whispered at every dinner table she had ever been permitted to sit at, which, in her family's house, was not many. She had read between the lines of every letter that had passed through that household for the past 4 months. She had even, God help her, written some of those letters herself. She knew exactly who the Duke of Ashford was. And on a gray Tuesday morning in October, with her hands folded neatly in her lap and her best dress pressed carefully the night before, she stepped into a carriage headed for his estate, not because she was brave, not because she was foolish, but because she had absolutely nowhere else to go. She told herself it would be fine. She almost believed it. Clara Voss was the third daughter of Baron Voss, which meant she was, by the quiet and efficient logic of English society, practically invisible. The first daughter, Isabel, was beautiful. This was known and agreed upon by everyone who had ever seen her, and Isabel herself had understood it from a very young age with the calm certainty of someone who had been told a useful fact and filed it away for future use. She had golden hair, a delicate laugh, and the particular talent of making men feel as though they had just said something very clever, even when they hadn't. The second daughter, Margaret, had married well at 19 and moved to Edinburgh, where she wrote letters home that were cheerful and short and said very little about whether she was actually happy. Clara was the third. She had brown hair that was neither striking nor plain, a mind that moved faster than most people around her found comfortable, and the unfortunate habit of saying true things at moments when untrue things would have served everyone better. She was not ugly. She was not charming. She read too much, spoke too carefully, and had never once in her 22 years made a man feel clever by accident. Her stepmother, Lady Voss, had assessed all of this early and drawn her conclusions. Clara was useful. Clara could manage the household accounts. Clara could write letters when Isabel could not be bothered, which was often. Clara could sit quietly at the far end of the room and not embarrass anyone. What Clara could not do, Lady Voss had decided, was compete, and so no effort was made on her behalf. No new dresses, no introductions, no carefully arranged encounters with eligible gentlemen. Isabel was the investment. Clara was simply the furniture. For a long time, Clara had made peace with this. Then the Duke of Ashford wrote his first letter. It had begun, as most catastrophes do, with something that seemed entirely manageable. The Duke's solicitor had made contact in early June. The Duke of Ashford, Edmund Ashford, 5th Duke, one of the wealthiest men in England, famously uninterested in marriage until, apparently now, was prepared to consider a formal arrangement with the Baron's eldest daughter. He was not a romantic man. He had no patience for the theater of courtship. He proposed instead a correspondence. Letters. If the lady proved to be a person of reasonable intelligence and sincere character, he would proceed. If not, he would not. He wished to waste no one's time. Lady Voss had read this letter 3 times. Then she had called Isabel into the sitting room and explained the opportunity with great enthusiasm. Isabel had listened politely and then said, with the particular serenity of someone who has already made up her mind, that she found the Duke's approach rather cold, and that she didn't think she could write a proper letter to save her life, which was true, and that she had, in any case, already formed an attachment to a certain Mr. Fenwick, who had wonderful eyes and very little money, and she intended to marry him instead. Lady Voss had not taken this well. For 2 days there had been arguments. Doors had been closed with great firmness. Isabel had remained unmoved in the particular way that beautiful people who have already secured an alternative sometimes are. On the 3rd day, Lady Voss had appeared in the doorway of Clara's room, where Clara was sitting with a book, and had looked at her with the expression of a woman who has just solved a problem she is not entirely proud of solving. "You'll write the letters," she said, "as Isabel, just until we sort this out." Clara had looked up from her book. "I beg your pardon. The Duke wants correspondence. Isabel won't do it. You're good with words." Lady Voss said this without any particular warmth, as one might note that a tool is well suited to a job. "He'll never know the difference. It's only letters." "It's deception," Clara said. "It's practical," Lady Voss said, and closed the subject. Clara had written the first letter with every intention of making it dull enough that the Duke would lose interest within a fortnight. She had not counted on him writing back. His replies were not warm. They were not flowery. They did not contain a single line that could be called romantic by any reasonable definition. But they were sharp and honest, and occasionally, in the spaces between the formal language, unexpectedly dry. He had opinions. He expressed them without apology. He asked questions that assumed she had a mind worth answering him with. Clara, who had spent 22 years being treated as furniture, had found this rather difficult to resist. She had written back, then again, then again. By September, there were 11 letters. By October, she had stopped pretending she was writing as Isabel and was simply writing as herself, wearing Isabel's name like a coat she had borrowed and forgotten to return. She had told herself it was harmless. She had told herself she was only words on a page to him, nothing more. She had told herself a great many things. Then, on the 14th of October, Isabel climbed into a carriage at dawn and ran off to Gretna Green with Mr. Fenwick of the wonderful eyes and very little money, leaving behind a note, a scandal, and one very significant problem. The Duke of Ashford was expecting his future bride to arrive at his estate in 4 days. Clara found out in the carriage. Not before, not the night before, when she might have had time to think, to object, to find some alternative. Lady Voss had told her only that she was needed for the journey, that there were arrangements to be made, that she should pack her good dress and not ask unnecessary questions. It was only when the carriage had been moving for 2 hours, and the city had given way to open countryside, that Lady Voss folded her hands and explained, with the calm of someone delivering mildly inconvenient weather, that Isabel was gone, that the engagement could not be dissolved without catastrophic consequences for the family's finances and reputation, and that Clara would therefore be proceeding to Ashford Estate in her sister's place. Clara stared at her. "He has never met Isabel," Lady Voss said. "He knows only what is in the letters, and you wrote the letters." "He thinks he is corresponding with Isabel," Clara said, very carefully, as though she were explaining something to someone who had lost the ability to understand simple sentences. "He will be expecting Isabel." "He will be expecting a woman of intelligence and character," Lady Voss said, "which you are, so there is no problem." Clara opened her mouth. "There is no problem," Lady Voss said again, with great finality, and looked out the window. Clara spent the remaining 2 hours of the journey doing what she had always done. When Lady Voss made decisions she had no power to reverse. She thought. She thought about the letters, about 11 careful, honest, entirely misrepresented exchanges between herself and a man who believed he was writing to someone else, about the dry wit in his replies and the questions he had asked, and the one line in his 4th letter that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold, I find that most people say what they believe I wish to hear. It is, I confess, rather exhausting. I wonder if you are different." She had written back, "I cannot promise I am different. I can only promise I am tired of the same performance everyone else seems to find so natural." He had not replied to that for 6 days. She had assumed she had miscalculated. Then his reply had come, and the first line was, "Good, then we understand each other." Clara pressed her fingers together in her lap and looked at the passing fields, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that the man who had written those words was, in 4 days, going to look at her face and know immediately that something was very wrong. She had no plan. She had no ally. She had one good dress, and a name that wasn't hers, and the quiet, sinking certainty that this was going to end very badly. The gates of Ashford Estate appeared in the distance, iron and tall against the gray October sky. Clara straightened her back, smoothed her skirts, and reminded herself that she had survived 22 years of being nobody's first choice. She could survive this. She almost believed it. The gates of Ashford Estate did not creak. Clara had expected them to. Every estate in every story she had ever read had gates that announced themselves, iron hinges worn with age, a groan of metal that said asterisk, you are entering somewhere significant, somewhere old, somewhere that has seen better days and knows it. It was practically a requirement. Ashford's gates swung open in complete silence, as though they had been oiled that very morning, as though the estate itself was too disciplined to make unnecessary noise. She should have taken it as a warning. The house was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful without trying, without flowers in the windows or ivy softening the stone, or any of the small, apologetic touches that lesser estates used to seem more welcoming. It was simply large and perfectly proportioned and entirely sure of itself, set against the October sky like a statement that required no elaboration. Clara counted 4 stories. She stopped counting after that because it seemed impolite to be caught doing arithmetic upon arrival. The carriage rolled to a stop before the entrance. A footman appeared, then another, then a woman in a dark dress with the particular posture of someone who had managed a large household for many years and intended to continue doing so with or without anyone's approval. The housekeeper, Clara guessed, a Mrs. Holt, whose name had appeared once in a letter as *a woman who will see to your comfort and who does not tolerate fuss, so please do not fuss. Clara had liked that line. She had written back, I am not a great fuss maker by nature. My stepmother has cured me thoroughly of the habit. He had replied, then you and Mrs. Holt will get along perfectly. She was thinking of this when the front doors opened. He was taller than she had imagined. She did not know why she had imagined anything at all. Letters gave no physical information, and she had made a deliberate effort not to construct a person from words alone, having read enough novels to know that the imagined version was always a disappointment against the real one. And yet she had imagined something controlled and perhaps a little gray, someone whose coldness had a visible quality to it, like frost on glass. Edmund Ashford was not gray. He was perhaps 32 or 33, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been called handsome in a warmer man, and was, in him, simply striking, all sharp angles and careful composure, dark eyes that moved to the carriage before the footman had finished opening the door. He stood at the top of the entrance steps with his hands behind his back and watched her descend with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Not cold, Clara thought despite herself, contained. There was a difference. She had not expected to notice it so immediately. Lady Voss descended first, all gracious smiles, and began speaking before her feet had properly met the gravel. Your Grace, what a magnificent approach! The grounds are even lovelier than I had imagined, and the house itself is simply. Miss Voss, the Duke said. Lady Voss stopped. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Clara, who had reached the bottom of the steps and was now standing very still, her hands quiet at her sides, her heart performing something that could not charitably be called a normal rhythm. Miss Voss, he said again, and it was not a question. It was the specific tone of a man who has catalogued a piece of information and is now filing it correctly. Your Grace, Clara said. Her voice, to her great relief, came out even. He looked at her for a moment, not the sweeping, assessing look that men at balls gave women, measuring and dismissive. Something more careful than that. Something that moved across her face as though he were checking something against a reference he carried internally. Then he said, You're not what I expected. The words landed in the space between them, with the delicacy of a stone dropped into still water. Lady Voss laughed, a bright social laugh with nothing behind it. Oh, Your Grace, Isabel is always surprising. She has such a unique. Yes, Clara said, cutting across her stepmother with a precision she did not entirely plan. I imagine I'm not. She met his eyes. She did not look away. Something shifted in his expression, not softening, not quite, but a fractional adjustment, like a door that has been closed for a long time moving a single inch on its hinges. Come inside, he said. Mrs. Holt will show you to your rooms. We will speak at dinner. He turned and walked back through the doors without another word. Lady Voss exhaled. Perfectly fine, she murmured mostly to herself. Perfectly fine start. Clara said nothing. She looked at the door through which the Duke had disappeared and thought about the way he had said asterisk, You're not what I expected, not disappointed, not suspicious. Almost impossibly, as though he had meant it as a compliment. She didn't know what to do with that, so she followed Mrs. Holt inside and decided she would think about it later. Dinner was at 7. Clara spent the intervening hours in a room that was larger than the entire upper floor of her family's London house, with a fire that had been lit before she arrived, and a window that looked out over grounds that rolled away into the distance in a way that seemed faintly unreasonable. Someone had placed a small vase of late autumn flowers on the writing desk. Not roses, something simpler, white and unassuming. She sat at the desk and did not write anything. She thought about what she knew of Edmund Ashford from his letters. He was precise. He did not use 2 words when one would do, but the one word was always exactly right. He had strong opinions about the management of agricultural land, the failures of certain parliamentary committees, and the general dishonesty of people who said one thing in company and another in private. He had no patience for performance. He had, in his 6th letter, said something that she had turned over in her mind many times since. I have found that most cruelty in this world is not committed by cruel people. It is committed by comfortable ones who find it easier not to look. She had thought about that line for 3 days. She had written back, And do you look? He had replied, after a pause of 4 days that she had spent in moderate anxiety, I try to. I am not always certain I succeed. That was the letter she had reread the most. She arrived at dinner precisely on time, which she later understood was unusual. Most guests, Mrs. Holt told her afterward with careful neutrality, arrived several minutes late as a matter of social habit, the implication being that their time was valuable enough to spend on other things first. The Duke was already seated. He looked up when she entered. Something moved across his face, that same fractional adjustment, and he rose, which she had not expected, and waited until she had taken her seat before sitting again. Lady Voss was not present. She had claimed a headache which Clara suspected was tactical, an attempt to give the impression of a young woman presented alone, unguarded at her best. It was the kind of maneuver Lady Voss considered subtle. The Duke poured her wine himself, which seemed to surprise the footman standing nearby. "You're punctual," he said. "You mentioned in your—" She stopped, caught herself. "In your letters" was not something Isabelle Voss should say with that particular familiarity. "I was told dinner was at 7. "It was. Most people treat that as a suggestion." "I don't find much use in suggestions," Clara said. "If something is worth doing, it's worth doing at the indicated time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his glass. "You wrote something similar once, about appointments." Clara's heart did something she could not afford it to do. "Did I?" "In your third letter. You said—" He paused. The faintest line appeared between his brows, as though he were consulting a text he had memorized against his better judgment. "You said that lateness was a form of dishonesty, that it implied your time was worth more than the other person's." She knew exactly what she had written. She had written it at 10:30 on a Tuesday night with a candle burning low, and she had almost crossed it out because it seemed too strong, too much like herself, and not enough like the gracious, charming Isabelle she was supposed to be performing. She had not crossed it out. "I remember," she said, which was true and also, under the circumstances, profoundly dangerous. He looked at her. "Do you always mean what you write?" The question was simple. The question was a cliff edge. "I try to," she said, and heard the echo of his own words come back through her mouth, and watched something in his face go very still. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "Good." One word. The same word he had used in his reply to her 5th letter, when she had said something honest that she had expected to alarm him. Good. As though honesty, in his world, was rare enough to be worth marking. Clara looked down at her plate and told herself, with great firmness, that she was not moved by this, that she was in an impossible situation of someone else's making, that the man across the table had been deceived and would eventually know it and would, quite reasonably, never forgive her. She told herself all of this. It didn't help as much as she needed it to. After dinner, he walked her to the base of the staircase. Not a formal gesture, not quite, just a few steps in the same direction that somehow became an accompaniment. He stopped at the bottom step, and she turned to say good night, and found him looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace." "The letters," he said it simply, without preamble, watching her face. "I had formed a certain impression." Her breath held itself. "I find," he said, "that the impression was not inaccurate." He said it as though it mattered, as though he had been waiting to find out, and the finding out had settled something. Then he nodded, a small, contained gesture, and walked back toward his study without another word. Clara stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment longer than necessary. The impression was not inaccurate. He had formed his impression from her words, her thoughts, her honest and unguarded and entirely anonymous self, written under another woman's name in the small hours of the night. He thought he had been right about Isabelle. He had been right about Clara. And she had absolutely no idea what to do with that. She went upstairs. She did not sleep for a very long time. The staff of Ashford Estate had a system. It had developed organically over the years, the way all truly effective systems do, not designed by anyone in particular, not written down anywhere, but understood completely by everyone involved. It worked as follows. When the Duke was in a certain mood, which was most moods, you did your work quietly and efficiently and did not draw attention to yourself. When he was in a darker mood, which happened perhaps twice a year and always for reasons no one fully understood, you did your work quietly and efficiently and did not make eye contact. And when something unusual occurred, something that disrupted the careful, calibrated atmosphere of Ashford Estate, you noted it, filed it away, and discussed it in the kitchen after supper with the particular relish of people whose lives are otherwise very orderly. Miss Voss had been in the house for 4 days. There was a great deal to discuss. It began with small things. The Duke took his morning coffee in his study, alone always. He had done this for 11 years without variation. On Miss Voss's second morning, Mrs. Holt had found her in the corridor outside the study at precisely 8:30, looking at a painting, a large, rather severe landscape that had hung there for decades and that no guest had ever remarked upon. Mrs. Holt had asked if she required anything. Miss Voss had said no. She was simply looking at the painting, and then she had said, with the careful, observational tone of someone thinking out loud, that she found it interesting that whoever had chosen it had placed the human figure so far to the left of the frame, almost out of the picture entirely, as though the landscape itself was the subject, and the person merely an afterthought. Mrs. Holt had said she would pass that observation along. She had not expected to pass it along, but the Duke had appeared in the doorway of his study 30 seconds later with his coffee cup still in his hand, and he had looked at Miss Voss, and then at the painting, and then he had said, "My grandfather chose it. He believed that was the correct relationship between a man and his land." Miss Voss had considered this, and do you? "No," the Duke said, "I think it's rather lonely." Then he had gone back into his study. Mrs. Holt had filed this away and gone about her morning, with the expression of a woman who has witnessed something she cannot yet explain but fully intends to. On the third day, he joined her for breakfast. This had never happened before. Not with any guest, not with family, not with anyone. The Duke breakfasted alone. This was not a rule that had ever needed to be stated because it had never been tested. He simply appeared in the breakfast room at 7:30, where Clara was already seated with a cup of tea and a book she had borrowed from the library, and he sat down across from her without any explanation and poured himself coffee and said, "What are you reading?" Clara, who had not heard him come in, managed not to drop the book. "Gibbon," she said. "The Decline and Fall. I hope you don't mind, I found it on the 3rd shelf." "I mind very much," he said. "It's in the wrong place, it belongs on the 2nd shelf." She looked at him. "Chronological," he said, without looking up from his coffee. "The library is organized chronologically. Gibbon is 18th century. The 3rd shelf is 17th. "I see," Clara said. "I apologize for my vandalism." He looked up. Something moved at the very corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not anything that could be proven in a court of law, but something. "Don't do it again," he said. She returned the book to the correct shelf after breakfast. When she went back to the library the next morning, Gibbon had been replaced with Thucydides, which was also on the 2nd shelf, with a small slip of paper tucked inside the front cover that said only, "Earlier, and perhaps more relevant to your current situation. A**. She read it twice. She put it in her pocket. She did not examine too carefully why she put it in her pocket instead of leaving it behind. Lady Voss noticed. Of course she noticed. Lady Voss had the particular observational talent of someone who had spent years monitoring other people's advantages and calculating what they meant for her own position. She said nothing directly. She never said anything directly, but Clara caught her watching at dinner on the 4th evening, when the Duke had said something dry about the county's annual fox hunt, and Clara had replied without thinking, and they had gone back and forth for perhaps 3 minutes on the subject of whether tradition was an adequate justification for anything, while Lady Voss sat at the end of the table with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Later in the corridor, Lady Voss had taken Clara's arm with gentle firmness. "You're doing well," she said, in the tone she reserved for moments when she meant something different from what she was saying. "Thank you," Clara said carefully. "Don't do too well," Lady Voss said, and patted her arm and walked away. Clara stood in the corridor and translated this, which did not take long. Don't become the story. You are a placeholder. You are buying time until I find a better solution. Do not forget what you are here. She went to her room and sat by the window for a long time, watching the grounds go dark. She was not a placeholder, she knew that. She also knew that knowing it changed nothing. The staff, meanwhile, had progressed from noting to actively discussing. Thomas, the Duke's valet of 7 years, had reported to the kitchen that His Grace had asked, entirely without context, whether Miss Voss had mentioned finding her rooms comfortable. This was unprecedented. His Grace had never in 7 years asked about a guest's comfort. He addressed practical matters. Comfort was Mrs. Holt's domain, and he left it there without encroachment. Mrs. Holt herself had noted that the Duke had walked past the morning room twice on Tuesday without entering, which she would not have remarked upon, except that she had seen him do the same thing on Monday, and on both occasions Miss Voss had been inside. "He's working up to something," said Annie, the upstairs maid, with the authority of someone who has read a great many more novels than anyone suspects. "He's being polite," said Thomas, with the skepticism of someone who has known the Duke for 7 years and is not entirely sure he recognizes this behavior. "When," said Mrs. Holt with great finality, "has His Grace ever been simply polite?" Nobody had an answer for that. It was on the 5th evening that Clara understood something she had been carefully avoiding understanding. She was in the library, the correct section of the library, second shelf, when he came in. He did not knock, which was his right since it was his library, but he paused in the doorway when he saw her, and that pause was new, as though he was deciding something. He came in. He sat in the chair across from hers, which no one had sat in her presence before, and he opened his own book, and for 40 minutes they simply read in the same room without speaking. It was the most comfortable Clara had felt since she was a child. That was what she had been avoiding understanding. Not that he was kind to her. He wasn't precisely. Kind wasn't the right word for what he was. He was asterisk present with her, fully, completely, without the distracted half-attention that most people offered and called consideration. When he spoke to her, he meant it. When he listened, he actually listened. When he was silent with her, it was a comfortable silence, not the weighted, loaded silence of someone waiting for you to say the right thing. He treated her, Clara realized, as though she were worth the full use of his attention. She was 22 years old, and she could not think of another person who had ever done that. She looked at the page in front of her and did not read a single word of it for the remaining 40 minutes. And when he said good night and left, she sat in the chair for a long time after and had a very firm, very private conversation with herself about the nature of her situation and the absolute necessity of not making it worse. She was here under a false name. She had written letters that had created an attachment, his attachment, which she had no right to have built and no honest way to keep. She was going to have to tell him. Not yet, not until she had some idea of how, but eventually. And when she did this, all of this, the breakfast and the library and the slip of paper she still had in her pocket would be over. Don't make it worse, she told herself. She already knew she wasn't going to listen. The letter from Isabel arrived on the 7th morning. It was short. Isabel's letters were always short. She had the attention span for approximately 3 sentences before she felt she had communicated sufficiently. "Dearest Clara," it said, "I hope you are managing. I am very happy here, which I know you think is selfish, and perhaps it is, but I couldn't help it. Mr. Fenwick is wonderful, and I don't regret it even a little. I only ask one thing. Do not tell the Duke the truth. I know that seems unfair to you, and I suppose it is, but if it comes out that I ran off to Gretna Green, Father will be ruined. I don't want that. I just also couldn't marry a man I've never met when Mr. Fenwick exists. You're so much better at managing things than I am. I always knew you'd find a way. All my love Isabel. Clara folded the letter very precisely and placed it on the writing desk and looked at it for a long time. You're so much better at managing things than I am. This was true. It was also, Clara reflected, the kind of compliment that delivered itself wrapped in a demand. She picked up the letter. She put it in the drawer. She went downstairs for breakfast, where the Duke was already seated with his coffee, and he looked up when she came in, and for just a moment before she composed herself, before she put everything back in its proper place, something must have shown on her face because his expression shifted. "Are you all right?" he said. 2 words, direct, unadorned, entirely genuine. She almost told him everything right then. "Perfectly well," she said instead, and sat down and poured her tea, and told herself she would find a way to manage it. She always found a way to manage things. The ball was Lord Harwick's idea, or rather Lord Harwick's wife's idea, which meant it had been executed with considerable ambition, and announced with the kind of enthusiasm that left no graceful means of refusal. The county's leading families were invited. The Duke was expected to attend. Miss Voss, as his guest, would accompany him. Clara had known about Lord Harwick from the letters. The Duke had mentioned him once briefly, in a way that said a great deal while appearing to say very little. Harwick is a man who collects weaknesses the way other men collect art. I find him useful to know and inadvisable to trust. She had not needed further elaboration. The ball was on a Friday. It was, by any objective measure, a successful event. The rooms were warm, the music was competent, and the county's assembled families had turned out in their best with the particular energy of people who had been waiting for something to look at and had finally been provided one. What they were looking at, Clara understood within the first 10 minutes, was her. Not unkindly, most of them. Curiosity, primarily. The Duke of Ashford, notoriously unattached, had arrived with a young woman, and that young woman was being assessed with the efficient thoroughness of people who considered social information a form of currency. She felt the assessments moving across her like weather. She kept her spine straight and her expression pleasant and told herself she had survived drawing rooms before. The Duke stayed near her. Not attached to her side, he was not demonstrative. She already knew that, but present, within a certain radius, in a way that she gradually understood was not accidental. She was talking to a Mrs. Alderton, a pleasant woman of perhaps 50 who had known the Duke's mother, when Lord Harwick appeared. He was a large man, not in height but in presence, the kind of man who took up more space than his physical dimensions required. He had a broad smile and small, bright eyes that moved too quickly, cataloging things. "Miss Voss," he said with great warmth, "what a pleasure. We have heard so much about you." "You are too kind," Clara said. "Not at all," he smiled. "Tell me your family is in Wiltshire, is that right? The Voss estate. I believe I knew your father some years ago, and your sister, the eldest girl, Isabel, wasn't it? I thought she was," he paused, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has not paused by accident. "I thought she was the one who was expected here." The room didn't go quiet. It was too large for that, the music still playing, 20 conversations still running. But in the small circle around them something shifted. Mrs. Alderton looked at her gloves. Clara looked at Lord Harwick and understood, with complete clarity, that he knew exactly what he was doing. This was not a social misstep. This was a very small, very precise blade, inserted in a public place where she could not react without drawing more attention than the wound itself. She opened her mouth. "Harwick." The Duke's voice came from approximately 1 step behind her left shoulder. She had not heard him approach. She did not turn around immediately, because she was watching Lord Harwick's face, and she wanted to see what it did. What it did was adjust. A recalculation, fast and smooth, the smile remaining but its quality changing, less sharp, more careful. "Ashford," Lord Harwick said, with undiminished warmth, "I was just getting acquainted with your charming—" "I heard you," the Duke said. 3 words, quiet enough that only their small circle could hear them, carrying, somehow, the absolute weight of a man who has said what he intended and requires no elaboration. Lord Harwick laughed, a social laugh, easy and practiced. "I meant no offense, of course, simply making conversation." "Of course," the Duke said, "if you'll excuse us." It was not a question. It was not quite a dismissal, too quiet for that, too controlled. But Lord Harwick found, somehow, that he was no longer part of the conversation, and that there was nothing he could gracefully do about it. The Duke moved to Clara's side, not taking her arm, not quite, but placing himself in a way that was unmistakably deliberate. Mrs. Alderton, with the excellent instincts of a woman who had navigated 50 years of social situations, began talking about the music. Later, when the carriages were being called and the evening was unwinding, Clara found herself standing near the door with the Duke, waiting for their coats. The room was thinning. The music had stopped. Around them, people were engaged in the busy, cheerful business of departure. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the room, not her, with that same contained expression she had been learning to read at the edges. "Harwick enjoys finding soft places in people," he said. "He has made a considerable study of it." "And you thought I had soft places," Clara said, not quite a question. He looked at her then. "I thought he had found the wrong person to try it on." A pause. "And I thought it was a conversation he should not have been permitted to finish." Clara looked down at her gloves. There was something sitting in her chest that she was having increasing difficulty categorizing. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, with a finality that wasn't cold exactly, but that closed the subject in a way that said he hadn't done it for thanks, hadn't done it to be owed anything, had done it simply because it was what he thought should be done. She thought about Isabel's letter in the drawer upstairs, about the name she was wearing that wasn't hers, about the 7 letters she had written under a false identity to a man who had, apparently, stored them well enough to quote them back to her over dinner. She thought about what he had said in the library, the very first day, words she hadn't been able to set down since. I find that the impression was not inaccurate. The carriage came. They rode back to Ashford Estate in companionable quiet, Lady Voss dozing in the corner, the dark countryside moving past the windows. Clara stared out at the dark and made herself think clearly. She was going to have to tell him the truth. She had known it from the carriage on the first day, and every day since had added weight to the knowing without adding any solution to the telling. She couldn't keep this. Whatever this was, the breakfasts and the library and the slip of paper and the way he had placed himself between her and Harwick without being asked, she could not keep it, because it had been built on something false and he deserved to know that, and when he knew it, it would end. She was going to tell him. Not tonight. Soon. Edmund Ashford did not, as a rule, revisit things. This was not stubbornness, or not only stubbornness. It was simply that he had found, over the course of 33 years, that most things benefited from being decided once and filed correctly and not disturbed again. Indecision was a form of inefficiency. Doubt was a luxury that accomplished nothing. You looked at the available information, you formed a conclusion, and you proceeded. He had operated on this principle in business, in estate management, in his dealings with Parliament, and in the matter of his own emotions, which he kept organized with the same systematic attention he gave to everything else. The letters were the exception. He had not intended to reread them. He had taken them out on Thursday evening for a specific and practical purpose, to review what had been agreed about the visit, about timing, about the arrangements that had been discussed. And he had found himself, an hour later, still at his desk with the fire burning low and the sixth letter open in front of him, reading a passage he had read perhaps a dozen times before. "I think the problem with most people," she had written, "is not that they are dishonest exactly, but that they are so thoroughly practiced at the performance of themselves that they have forgotten there is a difference between the performance and the person. I have been guilty of it too. It is very easy, when the world only seems to want the performance, to stop offering anything else." He had replied to that letter after 4 days, which was longer than his usual response time, because he had needed to think about what he actually wanted to say rather than what was adequate to say. He had written, "I wonder if you have ever shown anyone the person rather than the performance, and if so, whether it was worth it." She had replied within 2 days, which was faster than her usual response time, once or twice. It wasn't particularly, but I find I can't stop trying, which is either optimism or stupidity, and I haven't decided which. He looked at that line now, and thought about the woman who had arrived at his estate 8 days ago with her hands folded in her lap, and her spine very straight and her eyes, brown, direct, entirely unafraid of looking at things, taking in his house with the calm attention of someone cataloging information rather than performing impressedness. He thought about the painting. He had been standing at his desk when Mrs. Holt came in to tell him that Miss Voss had been standing in the corridor for 10 minutes looking at the Whitmore landscape and had made an observation about the placement of the figure. He had gone out expecting. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Something conventional, something that would confirm the vague, unexamined worry that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the carriage had arrived. She had been standing with her head tilted slightly, the way people do when they are genuinely looking at something rather than pretending to look. And what she had said about the figure in the painting, the loneliness of it, the way whoever had chosen it had understood something about the relationship between a person and the space they occupied, was almost exactly what he had thought himself, standing in this same corridor at perhaps 14 years old, before he had learned that thoughts of that kind were not the sort you said aloud. He had said it aloud to her. He wasn't entirely sure why. The thing that was bothering him was small. He was a precise man. He noticed precise things, and what he had noticed, over the course of 8 days of breakfasts and dinners, and 1 evening in the library, and a ball at which he had experienced an unfamiliar but very clear impulse to remove Lord Harwick from the room by whatever means were most efficient, what he had noticed was a very small discrepancy. It was a matter of phrasing. In her 4th letter she had written, discussing punctuality, "I believe lateness is a form of dishonesty. It says, without saying, that my time has more value than yours. I find I cannot do it, even when it would be more convenient." At dinner on her first evening he had asked, not directly, he didn't ask things directly unless necessary about her punctuality, framing it as an observation. And she had said, "I don't find much use in suggestions. If something is worth doing, it's worth doing at the indicated time." Different words, same thought, the same precise, organized moral logic, arriving at the same conclusion from the same internal architecture. That was not what was bothering him. What was bothering him was the 3rd evening, in the library, when he had said, he had not meant to say it, it had simply come out, the way things sometimes did in rooms with low firelight and no audience. "I find that most people, when they are in a room with someone, are also somehow not quite there, as though they are saving the better part of themselves for a more important occasion." And she had looked up from her book and said, without any pause, "And then the more important occasion never comes, and they have spent their whole life being half present in all of it." He had not replied. He had gone back to his book. But later, going back through the letters, he had not meant to go back. He had simply found himself doing it. He had found the 9th letter, which he had read many times, in which she had written, "I sometimes think the greatest waste in the world is not money or time but attention. People hoard it for occasions that deserve it, and spend their whole lives waiting, and the occasions never come, and they die having been fully present for nothing at all." Same thought, same rhythm, same voice making its way through two different channels toward the same place. He sat at his desk for a long time. He was a man who proceeded from evidence to conclusion without sentimentality. The evidence was sitting in front of him in 11 letters and 8 days of observation, and the conclusion it was pointing toward was one that he needed to approach carefully, because it was the kind of conclusion that, once reached, could not be unreached. He picked up the 9th letter, he read it again, he put it down. He did not sleep well that night, which was unusual. He was, as a rule, an excellent sleeper. He did not say anything to her the next day, or the day after. He watched instead, with the patience of a man who has learned that observation is more reliable than interrogation. He watched the way she spoke, precise, unadorned, occasionally dry in a way that caught him off guard even when he was expecting it. He watched the way she listened, which was completely, without the restless quality that most people had when they were waiting for their turn to speak. He watched the way she moved through his house, which was not tentative. She had stopped being tentative after approximately the 2nd day, but also not presumptuous. She occupied the space she had been offered without encroaching on the space she hadn't. He watched her in the library, where she had returned every evening and where he had taken to joining her, not by plan, but by what he was increasingly forced to admit was preference. He watched her at breakfast, where she arrived exactly on time every morning with whatever book she was currently misplacing in the chronologically incorrect section of his library, and where she drank her tea before it cooled, and read actual sentences, rather than performing the act of reading the way guests usually did. He watched her with Lady Voss, which was the most informative observation of all. There was something in that dynamic, careful, managed, a particular quality of patience that looked like ease but wasn't, that he recognized without being able to immediately name. It was the patience of someone who has long practice at existing in a space where they are not quite welcome, and who has become so good at it that it barely shows. He recognized it because he had seen it in his own mirror, a long time ago. It was the Tuesday of the 2nd week when the thing happened. They were at dinner, Lady Voss present this time, which meant the conversation moved along different lines, more general, less direct. Lady Voss was talking about the upcoming winter season and the various engagements it would involve, and Clara was listening with the politely attentive expression she wore when she was thinking about something else entirely. He had asked, not meaning to disrupt anything, simply because the thought arrived, and he had not yet developed the habit of not saying things to her. "What are you reading currently?" She looked up. "The Memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon," she said. "I found it on the—" She stopped. A brief pause, very small, quickly controlled. "The second shelf." 17th century French court, he said. "An unusual choice." "I find courts instructive," she said. "The mechanisms are always the same. The costumes change." Lady Voss laughed, social and light. Clara has always had a great fondness for history. As a girl she was always— She stopped. It was a very small stop, less than a second, the kind of stop that no one noticed. Except that he noticed. "Clara," Lady Voss continued smoothly, "something about books and education and the value of a well-rounded mind," and the conversation moved on. And Clara, Miss Voss, the woman across the table whose name he had believed until approximately 30 seconds ago to be Isabelle, picked up her wine and took a careful sip and did not look at him. He looked at her. She did not look back. He returned his attention to his plate and finished his dinner, and contributed 3 or 4 sentences to the remainder of the conversation, all of them adequate, and none of them about the thing that was now sitting very quietly in the center of his mind like a key that has just found its lock. Clara, not Isabel. He thought about the letters. He thought about the painting and the library and the 11 evenings worth of dinner conversation, and the woman who had written "I cannot promise I am different. I can only promise I am tired of the same performance everyone else finds so natural." He thought about the slip of paper he had put in the Thucydides, and the fact that she had kept it. He had noticed the following day that it was gone from the book, which meant she had taken it with her, which meant. He set down his fork with great precision. He was not angry. He recognized this was perhaps the more surprising fact of the evening, and he turned it over carefully to examine it from all sides. He should be angry. He had been deceived, systematically, deliberately, over the course of 4 months and 11 letters, by a woman who had signed another name to words that were entirely her own. He should be angry. He was not. What he was, sitting at the head of his dinner table with the candlelight moving across the face of a woman who was watching her plate with the careful composure of someone waiting for a verdict, was something he didn't have a precise word for. It sat in his chest with a weight that was not unpleasant, which seemed medically improbable under the circumstances. He picked his fork back up. He ate the remainder of his dinner. He said good night at the appropriate moment and walked to his study and closed the door. He sat at his desk. He did not take out the letters. He didn't need to. He had read them enough times that he knew what they said, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who proceeds from evidence to conclusion, what they meant. He had not been corresponding with Isabel Voss. He had been corresponding with Clara Voss, who had written 11 letters under her sister's name and said true things in all of them, and had arrived at his house 8 days ago under false pretenses, and had been, nonetheless, exactly who she had presented herself to be in every word she had ever written. The performance and the person, she had written about that. He thought there was a particular irony in the fact that the only dishonest thing she had done was write honest letters under a dishonest name. He thought about what she must be carrying, the weight of it, the knowing, the waiting, the impossibility of the position. He thought about the way she had looked up when Lady Voss said her name, that fraction of a second before she controlled her expression. He thought about the quiet steadiness with which she had been managing, every day, something that would have broken a person with less backbone entirely. He sat at his desk for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in several years, which was make a decision based not on practical considerations, but on something considerably less structured than that. He took out a piece of paper. He wrote 4 words. He folded it, wrote her name on the outside, her real name, Miss Clara Voss, without hesitation, without performance, and rang for Thomas. "See that Miss Voss receives this in the morning," he said, "before breakfast." Thomas took the note with the carefully neutral expression of a valet who has opinions and knows better than to have them out loud. "Yes, Your Grace." He went to bed. He slept this time without difficulty. Clara found the note when she woke. It had been slipped under her door sometime in the early morning, a small folded square with her name on the outside written in handwriting she recognized from 11 replies, precise, unhurried, each letter exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. She sat on the edge of her bed in the gray morning light and held it for a moment before she opened it. She had known, sitting at dinner last night, the moment Lady Voss had said her name. She had felt it like a cold hand placed flat against her back, the awareness that something had shifted, that the air in the room had changed, that the Duke had gone very still in the particular way he went still when he was processing something rather than simply waiting. She had not looked at him. She had not been able to look at him. She had gone to bed expecting to not sleep, and had been correct. She unfolded the note. 4 words. Did you mean it? She stared at them. No preamble, no accusation, no explanation of what he knew or how he knew it or what he intended to do with the knowledge. Just 4 words that reached past every layer of the situation, the false name and the family scandal and the impossible position and all of it, and asked the only question that had ever actually mattered. The letters, did she mean them? Her hands were not entirely steady. She got up. She sat at the writing desk. She took out paper and she picked up her pen and she wrote back, not as Isabel, not as anyone's useful third daughter, not as a woman managing an impossible situation, but as herself completely, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. She folded the reply. She wrote his name on the outside. She rang for a maid. Then she sat very still in the morning quiet and waited to find out what came next. The reply came back within the hour. Not a note this time. A knock at the library door at 9:30, and when Clara opened it, it was not a maid or a footman but the Duke himself, still in his morning coat, with the particular quality of someone who has made a decision and is not going to spend any more time making it. He looked at her for a moment. "Come and have coffee," he said. Not a question, not quite a command. The tone of a man who has decided that the most sensible next step is a cup of coffee and is simply communicating this fact. Clara looked at him, at the 4 words she had spent half the night dreading and half the night hoping for, now standing in her doorway in a morning coat, and said, "All right." They went to his study, which she had not been in before. It was a room that looked like him, which she supposed was inevitable. Large, ordered, every surface serving a purpose. Books that were actually read rather than decoratively arranged. A desk that had work on it, real work, papers and correspondence, and the visible evidence of a man who ran a substantial estate with genuine attention. A fire already lit. 2 chairs positioned before it with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had simply moved the second chair to where it needed to be without making an event of it. He poured the coffee himself. He handed her a cup. He sat. She sat. For a moment neither of them said anything, which should have been uncomfortable and was not. "You wrote 20 minutes worth of reply," he said, "to a 4-word question." "I had a great deal to say," Clara said. "Yes," he said, "you did." He looked at the fire. She looked at her coffee. Outside, the October morning was doing what October mornings did: gray light, still air, the grounds of Ashford Estate lying quiet and unhurried beyond the window. "I want to say something first," Clara said. He waited. "I'm not going to ask you not to be angry. You have every right to be angry, and if you are, that is entirely reasonable, and I won't attempt to argue you out of it." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this in the long hours of the night, not the words exactly, but the steadiness, the not flinching. "What I did was wrong. The name was wrong, the pretense was wrong, all of it. I know that. I have known it since the beginning, and I did it anyway, and I cannot make that into something it wasn't." He said nothing. "But the letters," she said, and here the steadiness required more effort because this part she had not practiced. This part was simply true and terrifying in the way that true things are when you say them without armor. Every word in the letters was real. Every thought, every opinion, she stopped, steadied. Every answer to every question you asked. That was me, not a performance of me, just me. Silence. The fire moved. Outside, a bird crossed the window. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I know it was you," he said, without looking away from the fire. That was not in question. A pause. The question was whether you knew it. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon." He turned to look at her then with the direct, undeflected attention that she had spent 11 days learning the weight of. Whether you knew what you were actually saying, or whether you had told yourself it was only letters, only words, nothing that would matter. A beat. Some people are honest on paper in ways they don't intend to be. They write themselves and think they are writing a character. Clara was quiet for a moment. "I knew," she said. "I knew what I was saying. I tried to not know at the beginning, but by the third letter I knew." He nodded, once small, the gesture of a man filing something correctly. "Then we are in agreement about the letters," he said. "And the name," Clara said, because she was not going to let herself be let off something that she shouldn't be let off. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured but not cold, the distinction she had learned to make. "Your stepmother engineered a deception. Your sister participated in it. You were placed in an impossible position and you—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, brief and controlled. "You managed it the only way you could see to manage it, without hurting anyone you didn't have to hurt." "I hurt you," Clara said, "or I would have. I was going to tell you I was." "I know," he said again. "How do you know? I hadn't told you yet." He looked at her with an expression that was almost dry. "You have spent 11 days looking at me the way a person looks at something they are about to have to give up," he said. "It is not a subtle expression." Clara opened her mouth, closed it. "Also," he said, "you wrote it in your reply this morning, rather clearly." She had. She remembered writing it. "I was going to tell you, I had decided. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to asterisk." And she had not second-guessed putting it in because by the time she was writing she was past second-guessing. "So," the Duke said, and now there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard in 11 days, something that had not made it into any of the letters and that she therefore had no reference for, something that was, she thought, possibly relief, though on him it was so contained she couldn't be certain. "We know where we are." "Do we?" Clara said, because she genuinely didn't, and she was not going to perform certainty she didn't have. He looked at her. "You are Clara Voss. You wrote 11 letters. You meant all of them, and you are sitting in my study having coffee." A pause. "I would suggest we proceed from there." They proceeded from there. Not dramatically. That was not how either of them was built. There was no sudden warmth, no transformation, no grand gesture of the kind that novels required. There was simply a shift in the quality of things, a settling, as though something that had been slightly misaligned had been quietly corrected. He called her Clara after that morning without announcement or ceremony. She called him Edmund exactly once, by accident, over dinner 2 days later, and he looked up from his plate with an expression that she could not immediately read, and then he said, "Yes," and went back to his dinner, and that was that. Lady Voss noticed the shift and said nothing. She was a woman who knew when to consolidate a position rather than interrogate it. The staff noticed the shift and discussed it extensively. "He smiled," Annie reported, with the gravity of someone delivering significant intelligence. "This morning in the corridor, she said something and he smiled, a real one." "You're certain?" Thomas said. "I have worked in this house for 4 years," Annie said. "I know what his face does. This was different." Mrs. Holt, listening from across the kitchen, said nothing. But that evening she put an extra vase of flowers in the morning room, the one Miss Voss liked best, and if she had reasons for doing so, she kept them to herself. And then Lord Harwick came to dinner. It was not unusual in itself. Harwick and the Duke had a long acquaintance of the kind that involved regular social contact and mutual usefulness without anything that could honestly be called warmth. He arrived on a Thursday with his wife, a quiet woman who had learned to be very still in her husband's vicinity, and 2 other couples from the county, and the evening was a formal dinner rather than an intimate one, with candles and the good china and conversation that moved along proper lines. Clara was seated 3 chairs from the Duke, close enough for the occasional exchange, far enough that she spent most of the dinner talking to the couple on her left, a Mr. and Mrs. Parrish who were pleasant and genuinely interested in things, and with whom she found herself enjoying conversation more than she had expected to. Harwick was at the other end of the table. She was aware of him the way you are aware of weather coming, not certain of what it will do, but conscious that it is moving. The dinner passed without incident. The soup was excellent. Mrs. Parrish had strong opinions about the reform of poorhouses that Clara found genuinely interesting. The Duke caught her eye once across the table with an expression that communicated, with the efficiency of someone who has had considerable practice at saying things without saying them, that the Bordeaux was acceptable but the claret would have been better, which was a very specific piece of communication to convey across a dinner table, and which she understood completely, which perhaps said something about the two of them. It was in the drawing room after dinner, when the party had separated in the usual way, men in one direction, women in another, the conversations branching, that it happened. Clara was talking with Mrs. Parrish and Mrs. Harwick, the latter contributing very little but listening with careful attention, when Lord Harwick entered the drawing room earlier than the other men, alone, moving through the room with the ease of someone who has decided where he is going. He came to stand near their small group. He accepted a cup of tea that he did not drink. He made several minutes of conversation about the autumn, the roads, the general state of the county's social season, all of it effortless, all of it irrelevant. Then he turned to Clara with his broad smile and his quick, bright, cataloguing eyes, and he said pleasantly, in the voice of a man who has something to say and has been saving it, "I had occasion to be in London last week. I happened to encounter an acquaintance of yours, a Mr. Fenwick, I believe, recently married." The drawing room was not large. Mrs. Parrish was right beside her. 2 other women had drifted into earshot. Clara said nothing. "Charming man," Harwick continued, with the relentless momentum of a man who has started something and intends to finish it. "His wife, your sister, I understand. Miss Isabel Voss, she was quite lovely, very recently married by the look of things." He paused with exquisite timing. "I confess I was rather surprised, given that Miss Isabel was my understanding of who." He looked at Clara with wide, innocent eyes. "But I must be confused. Forgive me. You are Miss Isabel Voss, aren't you?" The room had gone quiet. Not entirely quiet. There were other conversations happening elsewhere. The clock was ticking. The fire was going. But in their corner, in the particular radius that Harwick had been constructing all evening, it was very quiet. Mrs. Parrish looked at Clara. Mrs. Harwick looked at her gloves. Clara felt the question land and stay, the way a blade stays when it has gone in properly. She felt the room around it, the eyes, the attention, the held breath of people who are witnessing something and know it. She thought about what she could say. She thought about her family, about her father's finances, about Isabel in Gretna Green, about all the things that a denial would protect and a confession would dissolve. She thought about the study and the coffee, and we know where we are. I would suggest we proceed from there. She thought about 11 letters and a man who had asked in 4 words whether she had meant them. She had spent her whole life managing, navigating, finding the careful path between what was true and what was survivable. She was very good at it. She opened her mouth. "My name," she said clearly into the quiet, "is Clara Voss. I am the 3rd daughter of Baron Voss. My sister Isabel married Mr. Fenwick in October, and I wish them every happiness." She held Harwick's gaze without flinching. "I came to Ashford Estate in my sister's place, under circumstances that were not of my choosing. The Duke is aware of this." Not all of it, not the letters, not the deception, not the months of pretense, but the essential fact, spoken plainly in public without evasion. The silence stretched. Harwick's smile had not moved, but his eyes had changed, a small recalculation, the look of a man who had been ready for a different kind of reaction and is adjusting. "Well," he said pleasantly, "how very?" "Harwick." The Duke was in the doorway. Clara did not know how long he had been there. She did not know how much he had heard. She knew only that he was standing very still in that particular way, and that his eyes were on Harwick with an expression that was not cold exactly but was entirely without warmth, which in him amounted to the same thing. The room rearranged itself around him, the way rooms did when someone with sufficient authority entered them and made clear, without words, that the prevailing dynamic was about to change. "I believe," the Duke said into the silence, "that I heard Miss Voss correctly." Not a question, a statement of fact, a line drawn with great precision in a public place. Harwick spread his hands. "Of course I meant no." "I know what you meant," the Duke said, quiet, carrying, the voice of a man who has no interest in pretending otherwise. "The evening is getting late. I believe your carriage is ready." It was barely 9 o'clock. Harwick looked at him. The Duke looked back with the specific quality of someone who has the higher ground and is not going to pretend otherwise out of politeness. Harwick laughed, short, social, the laugh of a man accepting a loss without appearing to. "Of course. Eliza," he looked at his wife, who was already setting down her teacup with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before. "A wonderful evening, Ashford, Miss Voss." He inclined his head to Clara with a smile that meant nothing at all. "A pleasure." He left. The room exhaled. Mrs. Parrish beside Clara said quietly, "Well, that was briskly handled." Clara said nothing. She was looking at the Duke, who was now speaking to Mr. Parrish with the composed ease of a host who has tidied a small disruption and is moving on, and who had not looked at her since entering the room. The other guests left at 10:30. Lady Voss went upstairs with her customary headache, which Clara suspected was, this time, genuine. The house settled. The fire in the drawing room was still going. Clara was sitting beside it, not because she had decided to sit there, exactly, but because her legs had stopped being willing to take her anywhere else, and this chair had been available. She heard his footstep in the doorway. She didn't turn around. He came into the room. He sat in the chair across from hers, the library chair, the study chair, the chair he consistently chose, the one that faced her, and he said nothing for a moment. "You told them," he said. "Yes." "You didn't have to." "I know." A pause fired the clock. "Clara," he said, and the way he said it, her name, her real name, without effort or ceremony, as though it had always been the obvious word, did something to her chest that she was not going to examine right now. "What Harwick did tonight was my fault," she said. "At the origin, it was my fault." "It was not your fault. I perpetuated." "You were placed in an impossible position," he said, with a quiet firmness that did not invite argument, "by people who should have known better, and you managed it with considerably more integrity than it deserved. A beat. You told the truth tonight in a room full of people when you did not have to, and when it cost you something to do it." "It cost you more," Clara said. "Your reputation, My reputation," he said, "is not your responsibility." She looked at him, he looked back. "I don't know what happens now," she said honestly. "No," he said, "neither do I, not precisely." The fire moved. "But I know," he said, with the same quality he had had in the study that morning, decided, clear, past the point of making the decision and into the territory of simply stating it, "that I am not interested in proceeding without the full information. And I have the full information now." Clara said very carefully, "And?" He looked at her for a long moment. "And," he said, "the impression was still not inaccurate." Her first evening. His words on the staircase. He had kept them, filed them, brought them back now with the precise deliberateness of a man who chooses his words once and means them indefinitely. She felt something give way, very quietly, somewhere in the region of her sternum. "Edmund," she said, and this time it was not an accident. He said yes. Just that, just yes. As though the name in her mouth was simply a word and not a thing she had been afraid to say and he had been waiting to hear. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it, the name and the letters and all of it, I am sorry." "I know," he said. "You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true." She looked at him. He was watching her with that full, unhurried attention, the attention she had been given nowhere else, that she had been given here from the first morning in the corridor, the attention she had been telling herself she could not keep because it was built on something false. It was not false. That was what he was telling her, had been telling her in his particular way, without performance and without elaboration. The letters were true, she was true, the rest was circumstances. She let out a breath that she felt she had been holding for a long time. "What happens tomorrow?" she said. He considered. "Breakfast," he said. 7:30, I believe you have Herodotus currently." "Thucydides, actually. I finished Herodotus." "The correct shelf, I hope." "Second shelf," she said. "I have learned my lesson." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said. "Then we proceed." She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, not thinking about the evening in the drawing room or Harwick's face, or the things she had said in public that could not be unsaid. Those things existed. They would have consequences. She would deal with them. She was thinking about the impression was still not inaccurate, asterisk, and we proceed. And the specific quality of a man saying asterisk yes, when you say his name as though it is simply the natural response to a natural thing. She thought about Isabel's letter in the drawer. She thought about what Isabel had written, "You're so much better at managing things than I am." And she thought that managing things was perhaps not actually the point, that managing things was what you did when the real thing wasn't available, and that somewhere in the last 11 days she had stopped managing and started simply being somewhere, actually being there, fully present, which she had not been in longer than she could accurately say. She thought about what she had written to him at 10:30 that morning, the 20 minutes of unguarded, unhurried, completely honest reply to 4 words. She thought about the fact that she had not, in any of it, been afraid. She got into bed. She slept this time without difficulty. The morning after the dinner, Ashford Estate was very quiet. Not the quiet of tension, not the held-breath stillness of a house waiting for something to break. The ordinary quiet of a well-run place going about its business, fires lit, breakfast laid, the grounds emerging from the November mist with the unhurried patience of things that have been here long enough not to be rushed by weather. Clara came down at 7:30. The Duke was already there. They had breakfast. She was reading Thucydides. He was reviewing correspondence. At one point he said, without looking up from his papers, "There is an error in your assessment of the Sicilian expedition, incidentally, from Tuesday." Clara looked up. "I haven't said anything about the Sicilian expedition." "You will," he said. "You're on book 6. She looked at him for a moment. "You've been tracking my progress." "The books move on the shelf," he said, still not looking up. "I notice things." She went back to Thucydides. He went back to his correspondence. It was, Clara thought, a perfectly ordinary morning. She did not examine this too carefully. She had learned, in the past 2 weeks, that examining things too carefully in Edmund Ashford's vicinity tended to produce feelings she had not budgeted time for. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, sitting in the breakfast room with her book and her tea, was what he had already set in motion. He had not slept badly after the dinner. He had, in fact, slept with the specific soundness of a man who has made several decisions and is satisfied with them. He had been awake at 5, which was his usual hour, and by 6 he had written 3 letters. The first was to his solicitor in London, a Mr. Graves, a precise and quietly ruthless man whom the Duke employed precisely, because he was precise and quietly ruthless. The letter contained a set of instructions that were calm, specific, and would have alarmed anyone who understood their implications. The second was to a Lord Pemberton, an old acquaintance in Parliament whose particular usefulness lay in knowing a great many things about a great many people, and being willing, under the right circumstances, to deploy that knowledge with surgical accuracy. The third was to a Mrs. Whitfield in Bath, who was nobody important on the surface of things and who was, beneath that surface, the most reliable source of accurate social intelligence in the southern counties. She knew everything. She remembered everything. And she owed the Duke a favor of the kind that did not expire. He sealed all 3 letters before breakfast and gave them to Thomas with instructions that they were to be dispatched by 8 o'clock. Thomas took them with the carefully neutral expression he had been perfecting for 7 years and said, "Anything else, Your Grace?" "Not yet," the Duke said. The replies began arriving within 48 hours, because the Duke's correspondence had a way of being treated as urgent by the people who received it. Mr. Graves wrote back first. His letter was 3 pages, dense with information, and it confirmed several things the Duke had suspected and revealed 2 things he had not known, one of which was worse than he had anticipated, and one of which was, in its own way, clarifying. The worst thing, Baron Voss's financial situation was considerably more precarious than the Duke had understood. The estate in Wiltshire was mortgaged substantially. There were debts, not catastrophic, not yet, but the kind that had been accumulating for years with the patient persistence of things that are not addressed because addressing them requires acknowledging them. Lady Voss had known. She had, in fact, been managing the situation for some time, with the particular competence of a woman who understands that her own comfort depends on the management. The clarifying thing, the letters. Mr. Graves had made discreet inquiries, as instructed, and had confirmed through a chain of information that the Duke did not need to fully trace, that the correspondence signed as Miss Isabel Voss had in fact originated from the 3rd daughter. This was not a surprise. It was, however, useful to have confirmed by someone other than himself. He read the letter. He put it in the locked drawer of his desk. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the surface. Clara had known, when she started writing, that her family's situation was precarious. She had known what was at stake. She had written 11 honest letters under a false name, knowing that the whole structure could collapse at any moment and take her family's finances with it. And she had still, in the 9th letter, written about the waste of being half present in your own life. Still, in the 5th letter, disagreed with him about agricultural reform with the calm confidence of someone who had read the relevant reports and formed her own conclusions, and was not going to pretend otherwise to manage his feelings. She had not managed his feelings once, in 11 letters. He found this, examined from this angle, rather remarkable. Lord Pemberton's reply arrived on the 2nd day. It was shorter than Graves's letter and more pointed, which was Pemberton's way. He had, as requested, looked into Lord Harwick. What he found was not surprising to anyone who had known Harwick long enough. The man collected information the way others collected debt, not because he needed it immediately, but because he understood its future value. He had known about Isabel Voss's elopement for some time. He had known about Clara's presence at Ashford Estate. He had waited with considerable patience for the right moment and the right audience. The question, Pemberton wrote, is what he intends to do with the remainder of what he knows, which based on my inquiries is rather more than he deployed at your dinner table. I would suggest moving before he does. I can arrange a conversation if you wish, the kind he would find clarifying." The Duke wrote back, "Yes, arrange it." He was not a vindictive man. He wanted to be clear about that, even in his own accounting of it. This was not vindictiveness. This was simply the recognition that Harwick had aimed at Clara in a room full of people, and that the appropriate response to that was to remove, quietly and permanently, his ability to aim at her again. He was very calm about it. Mrs. Whitfield's reply was the last to arrive, and the most interesting. She had, as always, exceeded the brief. He had asked about the Voss family's standing, and she had given him that concisely and accurately. But she had also, because she understood that information was most useful in context, given him something he hadn't asked for. "The third daughter," she wrote, in her small, precise hand, "has been known in certain circles as the useful one, which is the kind of description that tells you everything about a family and nothing complimentary about the people applying it. She managed the household from approximately 17. She educated herself rather thoroughly without anyone facilitating it. She was presented one season, inadequately, and then apparently forgotten about, which I can only describe as a significant oversight on someone's part. I mention this not because you asked, but because I thought you should know the shape of what you are dealing with. The girl has been furniture for a long time. People who have been furniture for a long time sometimes don't know how to be anything else, even when offered the opportunity. I would be patient." He read this paragraph twice. Then he folded the letter and put it with the others in the locked drawer, and he thought about Clara at breakfast this morning, reading Thucydides with the unhurried absorption of someone who had decided they were allowed to simply be where they were. And he thought that Mrs. Whitfield was very wise, but that in this particular case, her caution might be slightly unnecessary. He thought Clara Voss had spent enough time being furniture. He intended to do something about that. He went to find her that afternoon. She was in the morning room, which she had quietly claimed as her own over the past 2 weeks. Not officially, not with any statement, simply by consistently being there in the afternoons with whatever project she had set herself. Today it was correspondence of her own, he saw. Several letters laid out with the systematic organization of someone who had a great deal to say and was being methodical about it. She looked up when he came in. Something in her expression, a very faint, very quickly controlled flicker, made him think she had been half expecting something and wasn't entirely sure what. "Sit down," he said, taking the chair across from her. Then, hearing himself, "Please." The corner of her mouth moved. She put down her pen. He looked at her for a moment. "I want to tell you what I've done," he said, "and then I want to ask you something." She was very still. Not the frozen stillness of someone afraid, but the deliberate stillness of someone giving their full attention. "I have engaged my solicitor to address your father's debts," he said. "Not all of them, enough to stabilize the estate. It will be done quietly and without conditions attached to it. Your family will not know the source." Clara opened her mouth. "Let me finish," he said, not unkindly. "I have also spoken with Lord Pemberton about Harwick. What was said at dinner will be contained. Harwick will not speak on the subject again." A pause. "And I have made inquiries, discreet ones, about the nature of the letters and have had confirmed what I already knew, which is that the correspondence was entirely yours. I have documented this correctly with my solicitor." She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Not upset. Something more complex than upset. "You did all of this," she said, "in 2 days." "I work efficiently," he said. "Edmund," she said, and the name still did that thing, the small internal adjustment, the something settling. "Why?" He looked at her. "Because it needed doing." "That's not an answer." It's a complete answer, he said. Things that need doing should be done. You needed, he stopped, reorganized. He recognized, not accustomed to saying this kind of thing out loud, which was nobody's fault but his own. The situation was unjust. You had been placed in it by other people's decisions and left to manage it alone. That was wrong. I was in a position to address it, so I addressed it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You didn't have to do any of that, she said quietly. I wanted to, he said, which was the more honest answer and which he gave without apology. She looked down at her hands. Something moved across her face that she didn't suppress quickly enough, something unguarded and a little undone, the expression of a person who has been managing alone for a very long time and has just been told, for the first time in recent memory, that they don't have to. He gave her a moment. You said you wanted to ask me something, she said, when she had collected herself, which didn't take long because she was Clara Voss and collecting herself was something she did efficiently. Yes, he said. He looked at her, she looked back. The letters, he said, all of them, everything you wrote, the arguments, the opinions, the honest and occasionally inconvenient observations. He paused. Was that what you are? Or was that what you are when no one is watching? She was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure there's a difference, she said carefully, when the letters are involved. I stopped watching myself around the third one. Then here, he said, in this house, have you been watching yourself? She thought about it. He appreciated that she thought about it rather than simply answering. Less and less, she said. Good, he said. I would like you to stop entirely. She looked at him. I find, he said, with the deliberateness of a man choosing words that are going to matter and wanting to get them right, that I have become rather accustomed to the version of you that doesn't watch herself. I would prefer to keep that version. The morning room was very quiet. Keep, she said. For as long as she is willing, he said. Outside, the November light was doing the thing it did in late afternoon, going golden and brief, the way it did when the year was turning toward dark and the days were getting honest about their length. It fell through the morning room windows and lay across the floor between them in long, quiet strips. Clara looked at him for a long time. That is a very oblique proposal, Edmund, she said. Yes, he said, I am working up to the direct one. Her breath caught, he saw it. I see, she said very carefully. I have certain things to resolve first, he said. The situation with your family, the matter of Harwick. He stopped. The correct order of things. I want it done properly. I want there to be nothing left unaddressed before I ask you directly, because when I ask you directly, I want the answer to be about the question and not about circumstances. She looked at him with something that was not quite an expression he had a word for. Something that lived at the intersection of moved and exasperated, which he was discovering, was a combination she was particularly capable of. You are a very thorough man, she said. Yes, he said. It is, she said, occasionally maddening. I know, he said with complete composure. I've been told. She laughed. It was he had heard her laugh before, the controlled social laugh, the quiet, amused exhale. This was different. This was unguarded, real, a fraction of a second of pure, uncalculated response, and it was over quickly, but it happened, and he filed it correctly and kept it. All right, she said when she had recovered herself. Do your thorough work, resolve your situations. Thank you, he said. And Edmund, she said. He looked at her. When you do ask me directly, she said, don't be oblique. Something moved at the very corner of his mouth. I'll endeavor not to be, he said. He stood. He went back to his study. He sat at his desk and picked up his pen and continued the work with the focused efficiency of a man who has a great deal to do and is, for the first time in some time, very clear on why he is doing it. The situation with the family came first. He did not handle it himself. That would have been graceless. He used Graves, who was graceless in the specific, useful way of solicitors, capable of delivering uncomfortable information with the neutral affect of someone reading a weather report. Graves went to Baron Voss and explained, with precision and without ceremony, that certain debts had been acquired by an interested third party and that their terms had been restructured. He did not name the interested third party. He did not need to. Baron Voss was not a stupid man. He was a weak one, which was different, and the weakness expressed itself as a tendency to not examine things he was relieved about. He did not examine this. Lady Voss examined it. She said nothing, but her expression, Graves reported back, had the quality of a woman who has made a swift and accurate calculation and has decided to accept the result. Isabel in Gretna Green with her Mr. Fenwick was not consulted. She would find out eventually. The Duke suspected she would take it in her stride. Harwick took somewhat longer. Pemberton arranged the conversation as promised, a private meeting, the kind that left no record and required no witnesses. The Duke attended himself, which was unusual, and which he intended to be unusual, because he wanted Harwick to understand that this was not a matter he had delegated. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten in any explicit way. He simply explained, in the tone of a man stating facts that will not be contested, that Miss Clara Voss was under his protection, and that any further effort to use her family's situation as social ammunition would be met with a comprehensive and disproportionate response, the specifics of which Pemberton had thoughtfully made available. Harwick was a man who collected weaknesses. He understood, therefore, when someone else had collected his. "I see," Harwick said at the end of it. "Good," the Duke said and left. He told Clara only the essentials. Not because he was managing her, he was clear in his own accounting that he was not doing that, but because certain things had been done and were done and did not need to be narrated in detail. She was not a problem he had solved. She was a person he had cleared the space around, which was different, and the space was hers to use as she chose. He told her. The debts were handled, Harwick was handled, the letters were correctly documented. She listened with the full, unhurried attention she gave to everything. Then she said, "You are a very frightening man when you are motivated." "Only when it is warranted," he said. "Is that meant to be reassuring?" "Is it not?" She considered. Oddly, she said yes. On the Friday of the third week, a letter arrived from Lady Voss. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of a certain kind of letter, the kind that accomplishes a great deal while appearing merely to convey pleasantries. Lady Voss wrote that she intended to return to Wiltshire within the week, as there were matters at home requiring her attention. She wrote that she hoped Clara was well and settled. She wrote that she had every confidence things would resolve themselves satisfactorily, by which she meant, Clara understood, that she was withdrawing from the field and leaving Clara to whatever outcome presented itself. It was, in its own oblique way, a form of release. Clara read the letter twice. She put it on the writing desk. She sat for a moment with the quiet that comes when something that has been pressing from outside finally lifts. She thought about Mrs. Whitfield's letter, which she didn't know existed, the assessment she had never heard, the words furniture and asterisk forgotten that had been written about her in a letter she would never read. She thought about all the years of being useful and invisible, and what it felt like to be in a house where someone noticed when a book moved on a shelf, where someone saved a line about attention in a letter and brought it back to you over dinner 3 months later. She thought about the impression was still not inaccurate. She folded Lady Voss's letter. She put it in the drawer. Then she went downstairs to the library, where Thucydides was waiting on the correct shelf, and she settled into her chair by the fire and she read, unhurried and entirely present, in the house that had been gradually, quietly, without any formal announcement, becoming somewhere she recognized. He found her there at 5:30, as he usually did. He sat in his chair. He opened his book. The fire went on doing what fires do, the particular, patient constancy of something that asks nothing and simply continues. After perhaps 10 minutes of companionable silence, Clara said, without looking up, "Lady Voss is leaving on Monday." "I know," he said. "Graves informed me." "You knew before I did." "Probably." She turned a page. "Edmund." "Yes." "Have you resolved your situations?" He was quiet for a moment. "The relevant ones," he said. She looked up from her book. He was already looking at her, had been, she suspected, for a moment before she turned, with the full, unhurried, complete attention that was his particular way, that she had been given nowhere else and had stopped pretending she could live without. "Clara Voss," he said. Just that, her name. The way he said it, without effort, without performance, as though it had always been the natural word. "Yes," she said. "I would like to ask you something," he said, directly. Her heart, with the good sense it occasionally showed, went very still. "All right," she said. The fire moved. Outside the library windows, the November dusk was settling over Ashford Estate, long and blue and quiet, the grounds folding themselves into the early dark with the patience of things that have seen many evenings and are not troubled by one more. He looked at her. "Will you stay?" he said, "not as a guest, not as a visitor, not as anything provisional or temporary or arranged by someone else." A pause. "As my wife, of your own choosing and no one else's." The library was very quiet. Clara looked at him, at the man who had received 11 letters from a woman writing under a false name and had known, somehow, and had not said so, and had put Thucydides on the shelf with a note in it, and moved his chair and stood between her and Harwick in a room full of people without being asked. She thought about "I would be patient." She thought he had not needed to be, very long. "Yes," she said, "obviously yes." Something moved across his face, real, uncontrolled, a fraction of a second of pure, unguarded response. There, and gone so fast she almost missed it. Almost. She didn't miss it. "Good," he said with great composure, and went back to his book. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "You smiled." "I did not." "You did, I saw it." "You are misreading the firelight," he said, without looking up. "I am not misreading the firelight," she said. He turned a page. The corner of his mouth, just the corner, barely perceptible, entirely real, did something that could not be argued with. Clara looked back at her book. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. She wrote him a letter that night. Not because they were in different houses, not because the distance required it, not because there was anything left unresolved between them. She wrote it because she wanted to, which was a reason she had not permitted herself in a long time, wanting something simply because she wanted it, without calculating the cost first. She sat at the writing desk in her room with the fire going and the house quiet around her, and she wrote without stopping. The way she had written the reply to his 4 words, the way she had written the best of the 11 letters, without watching herself, without managing the impression, without leaving anything in reserve for a more important occasion. She wrote about the carriage, about the 2 hours of countryside going by while Lady Voss explained what she had done, and the way Clara had felt the gates of Ashford Estate appear in the distance like something inevitable rather than something chosen. She wrote about the painting in the corridor and what she had actually been thinking when she said what she said about the figure at the edge of the frame, that she had been thinking about herself, standing slightly outside every room she had ever been in, and that she had not meant to say it out loud and had said it anyway because the corridor was empty and the painting was honest and she had been tired. She wrote about the letters, about the third one when she had known she had stopped performing and started simply corresponding, and the particular freedom and terror of that. About the line he had written, "I find that most people say what they believe I wish to hear. It is, I confess, rather exhausting," and how she had read it at 10:30 on a Tuesday night and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately say, that someone had asked a question she was actually qualified to answer. She wrote about the library, about the specific quality of reading in the same room with someone who was also actually reading, not performing reading, not waiting for a pause in which to say something, just two people, separately and together, in the same comfortable quiet. She wrote, "I have spent a long time being useful, being manageable, being the version of myself that caused the least disruption to the people around me. I became very good at it. I am not sure I knew, until approximately the second week in your library, that I had also become rather lost in it." She wrote, "You asked if I meant what I wrote. I meant all of it. I mean this too." She did not write "I love you," because it seemed, on examination, both too large and too small for what she was trying to say. She wrote around it instead, "The way you describe a landscape by naming everything in it," and trusted that he would read it correctly, because he always read things correctly. She folded the letter. She wrote his name on the outside. She put it on the corner of the desk where the maid would find it in the morning. Then she got into bed and slept with the specific soundness of someone who has said everything they needed to say and has no revisions outstanding. He read it before breakfast. Thomas delivered it at 6:30 with the neutral expression that was no longer entirely neutral. There was something around the edges of it now that might, in another man, have been called warmth. The Duke took the letter, recognized the handwriting, and waited until Thomas had left the room before opening it. He read it once, quickly, the way you read something when you want the whole of it first. Then he read it again, slowly. He sat at his desk for some time afterward, not doing anything in particular, which was unusual for him. The fire was going. The early morning light was doing what it did in November, arriving reluctantly, gray and clean, laying itself across the room without committing to anything. He thought about the carriage she described, about a woman sitting with her hands folded in her lap for 2 hours while someone else arranged her life around her, and choosing, because it had been a choice. He understood now, she could have refused, could have done any number of things, choosing to walk through his gates anyway because she was tired and had nowhere else, and was not going to make a scene about it. He thought about the painting. He had been 14 years old when he stood in that corridor and thought the thing about loneliness, the figure at the edge of the frame, almost out of the picture, the landscape not noticing. He had not said it to anyone. He had filed it and moved on because that was what you did with thoughts that weren't useful. She had said it. Standing in his corridor on her first morning, having arrived under false pretenses in someone else's name, she had looked at the painting and said the true thing about it, without knowing he already knew it, without any reason to say it except that she saw it and it was true. He folded the letter. He put it in the locked drawer with the others, which now contained everything that mattered. 11 letters and Graves's confirmation and Mrs. Whitfield's assessment, and this, the last one, the letter that had not been necessary and had been written anyway because she had wanted to. He was not a man who said certain things easily. He was aware of this. He had arranged his life for a long time so that the things he could not say easily did not need to be said, so that the evidence of them simply accumulated quietly around the people they were intended for and could be read correctly by anyone paying attention. He thought Clara Voss paid more attention than anyone he had ever met. He took out a piece of paper. He wrote back, Not 20 minutes, 7 years of careful reticence were not going to dissolve in a single letter, but more than 4 words this time. More than he usually said. Enough that it was not oblique. He sealed it. He left it on the hall table on his way to breakfast. She found it beside her teacup. She looked at it for a moment before picking it up, his handwriting on the outside. Her name. The same precise and unhurried hand that had been writing to her for 4 months under the impression that he was writing to someone else. She opened it. It was not long. He was not a man who used 10 words when 3 would do, and he had not departed from this in her favor except in the places where precision required it, where the 3 words would not have carried the full weight, and he had chosen the full weight instead. She read it. She put it down. She picked up her tea, which was going cold, and she looked out the breakfast room window at the November grounds, and she did something she very rarely permitted herself, which was to simply feel a thing without immediately deciding what to do about it. The grounds were gray and still. The trees at the far edge had lost most of their leaves and stood with the particular dignity of things that are not embarrassed by what the season has done to them. A bird moved across the window. The fire ticked. The Duke came in at 7:25, as he always did, and sat down, and poured his coffee, and looked at her with the expression that was not quite neutral and had not been quite neutral for some time. "You wrote back," she said. "Yes." "More than 4 words." "Considerably more," he said, without apparent discomfort. She looked at him. He looked back, with the full and unhurried attention that she had stopped trying to account for and had simply started accepting, the way you accept weather or the particular quality of light in a place you have decided to stay. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "Thank you for the letter." "You're welcome," he said, simply, without deflection, without the managed understatement he usually used when something was important. Just, "You're welcome," as though receiving thanks for saying true things was reasonable and he intended to be reasonable about it. She went back to her tea. He went back to his correspondence. It was, again, a perfectly ordinary morning. She thought she might never take that for granted. She thought she would try very hard not to. Lady Voss left on Monday, as promised. The departure was efficient and, on Lady Voss's part, carefully dignified, the posture of a woman who has played a complicated hand and come out rather better than circumstances warranted, and who knows it, and intends to conduct herself accordingly. She embraced Clara in the entrance hall with the warmth of someone who has revised their position and is not going to draw attention to the revision. "You have done well," she said quietly in Clara's ear. Clara thought about all the things she could say to this. She said, "Goodbye, Lady Voss." The Duke bade her farewell with impeccable courtesy. Lady Voss stepped into the carriage. The carriage moved down the drive and through the gates, which swung shut behind it in their characteristic silence. Clara stood on the steps and watched it go. The Duke stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he said. She considered the question honestly, the way she always considered his questions. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." He nodded. He went back inside. She stayed on the steps for a moment longer, watching the empty drive, watching the gates, watching the November morning that was gray and still and entirely hers to stand in for as long as she chose. Then she went inside too. The announcement was made the following week. Not a grand announcement. That was not how either of them was built. A notice in the appropriate papers, a letter dispatched to the relevant families. The Duke's solicitor handled the formal instruments with the thoroughness he applied to everything. The county heard about it within approximately 48 hours, because the county always heard about things within 48 hours. The reaction was, by most accounts, surprised. Not displeased, or not primarily. The Duke of Ashford was a significant figure, and his business was always of interest, and his engagement was the kind of news that generated a great deal of opinion, most of it from people who had not met Clara Voss more than once. There was the question of the name. Some people had expected Isabel, had heard Isabel mentioned, were confused about the change. This question resolved itself, as such questions do, when people met Clara and found that she was not confusing at all. Mrs. Parrish, who had stood beside her at Lord Harwick's dinner and had watched the whole thing unfold, wrote a warm note of congratulation. Mrs. Alderton, who had known the Duke's mother, paid a call and stayed for an hour and told Clara, on departing, that she was exactly what she had hoped for, which was high praise from a woman who had hoped for very specific things for a very long time. Lord Harwick sent a correct and entirely unrevealing note of congratulation. Clara read it once and put it in the fire, which she felt was the appropriate response. The wedding was in December. Small by the standards of what it could have been, the Duke had no interest in spectacle, and Clara had spent enough of her life being arranged by other people to want, in this at least, only what she actually wanted. The church was the village church that sat at the edge of the estate grounds, old stone and honest light, with a good fire going and the smell of winter coming through the walls. Mrs. Holt cried, which she would have denied under any interrogation. Thomas maintained his composure throughout, which cost him more than anyone knew. Annie, who had predicted all of this from approximately day 4, felt entirely vindicated and said so to the kitchen at some length. Baron Voss attended. He looked at his daughter, really looked, in the way he had not done in some time, the way that had been inconvenient and so had not been done, and something moved across his face that might have been recognition, or regret, or simply the late understanding of a man who has spent too long not looking at things. He said very little. He kissed her cheek before the ceremony and she let him, which was its own kind of answer. Isabel sent a letter from wherever she and Mr. Fenwick were currently residing. It was 3 sentences, characteristically. The last one said, "I always knew you'd find a way. I didn't know it would be quite this good of a way, but then you always exceeded expectations, Clara, even mine." Clara folded the letter and put it in her pocket, and thought that this was probably the most honest thing Isabel had ever said to her, and that it was enough. The ceremony itself was brief. The vicar was a good man who had known Edmund Ashford since he was 12 years old, and who said the words with the straightforward sincerity of someone who means them, which Clara appreciated. She had had enough performance. She had no interest in more. She stood beside Edmund in the old stone church with the December light coming through the windows, and she said the words, all of them, each one precisely as she meant it, without reservation or management or calculation. And she listened to him say them back in the particular quiet voice that she had learned to hear correctly, the voice that did not perform and did not elaborate and meant every syllable of what it said. He looked at her when he said them. Not past her, not at the general idea of her. At her directly, with the full and unhurried attention that was his, and that he had been giving her since a corridor and a painting, and a thought about loneliness that they had both already had. She looked back. After, outside the church in the December cold, with the grounds of Ashford Estate visible over the low stone wall and the winter sky very clear and pale above them, he offered her his arm and she took it, and they stood for a moment while the small gathering reorganized itself around them. Mrs. Parrish said something to her husband that made him laugh. Mrs. Holt appeared briefly and then vanished back toward the house to ensure that everything was as it should be, which it was, because she had ensured it. Edmund was talking with the vicar. Clara stood beside him and felt the weight of his arm under her hand, and looked at the estate through the gate and thought about the carriage on the first day, the gray October morning, the iron gates appearing in the distance, The 2 hours of arrangements made by other people that had ended with her walking through someone else's door with her spine very straight and her best dress pressed, and absolutely nowhere else to go. She thought she would tell him that story eventually. Not today, today was for other things, but sometime. She thought he would want to know the full version, the part she hadn't written in any letter, the part about standing in the carriage with everything rearranged around her and choosing, despite everything, to walk through the gate. She thought he would understand it exactly. He turned from the vicar and looked at her, and she looked back, and there was that thing, the fractional adjustment, the something settling. And then he said, very quietly for her alone, "All right." She thought about the answer. She gave it honestly. "Yes," she said, "completely." He nodded. He offered his arm again, toward the house, toward the fire that would be lit and the dinner that would be ready and the library where 2 chairs sat before the hearth with the patient permanence of things that have found their arrangement and intend to keep it. She took his arm. They went home. 1 year later, Ashford Estate, December. The library was the same fire, same chairs, same 2 people arranged before it with the ease of a habit so thoroughly established it had stopped feeling like anything other than ordinary. Which was, Clara had come to understand, the highest form it could take. She was writing a letter. Not to Edmund. He was sitting 8 feet away, which made a letter unnecessary by any practical measure. She was writing to Mrs. Parrish, who had asked after them with the particular warmth of a woman who had been present at the beginning and felt a proprietary interest in how it had turned out. Clara was telling her. She wrote about the year, the estate in winter and then spring, the ground she had learned room by room and acre by acre, the library she had now read through in its entirety and reorganized once, correctly, and which had generated a 40-minute discussion about whether chronological was truly superior to thematic that had ended inconclusively and satisfyingly. She wrote about Mrs. Holt, who had stopped calling her Miss Voss sometime in February and had never explained why or announced the change, simply done it, which was very Mrs. Holt. She wrote about the morning in March when she had found a slip of paper tucked into a volume of Plutarch, second shelf correct placement that said only, still not inaccurate, E**. She had kept that one too. She wrote about the letter she had found in the locked drawer of his desk, which she had not been snooping in. She had been looking for the estate accounts, which he had asked her to review, and the drawer had been left open, which she chose to believe was an accident and which she strongly suspected was not. The letters were all there, 11, plus hers, plus his reply to hers, stacked with the precise care of someone who keeps things that matter. She had not said anything about it. She had reviewed the estate accounts and returned the key and gone about her afternoon. That evening in the library he had said, without looking up from his book, "The accounts are on the 3rd shelf, left side." "I found them," she said. "Good," he said. A pause. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "The drawer." He turned a page. "Which drawer?" "You know which drawer." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The key sticks. I've been meaning to have it fixed." "It didn't stick," she said. Another pause. "No," he said, "it didn't." She had looked at him. He had looked back, with the expression that was not neutral and had not been neutral for a very long time, and in it she had read, as clearly as anything he had ever written, everything she had needed to know about the locked drawer and what was in it, and why it was kept. She had gone back to her book. He had gone back to his. The fire had gone on being a fire. She was finishing the letter to Mrs. Parrish when she heard him put his book down. She kept writing. She had learned in a year to read the quality of his silences, and this one was the particular kind that preceded something rather than followed it. "You're writing about me," he said. "I'm writing to Mrs. Parrish." which includes writing about me. You feature, she said briefly. How briefly? Most of the letter. A pause. I see, he said with great composure. She signed the letter. She blotted it. She folded it with the crisp efficiency that was hers and had always been hers, the efficiency that had once been called useful and was now simply called Clara. She looked up. He was watching her, had been watching her, she knew, for some portion of the letter, because he watched her the way he read things he found worth reading, with the full, unhurried attention that had been hers since a painting in a corridor and a note in a book, and 4 words slipped under a door. What did you tell her? He said. Clara considered. That you smiled at our wedding, she said, twice, and that you still maintain you didn't. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. 3 times, he said. She stared at him. You said you didn't smile at all. I said I didn't smile. He picked up his book. I didn't say it was twice. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Edmund Ashford, she said. Yes. You have been managing this story for a year. I have been accurate, he said with complete serenity, for a year. There is a difference. She laughed, unguarded, real, the laugh that was only his, that she had stopped trying to contain sometime in January and had not retrieved since. He did not smile. His mouth did the thing it did, that corner, that barely perceptible movement, and he went back to his book with the composure of a man who is, quietly and entirely, exactly where he intends to be. She picked up her pen. She added a postscript to Mrs. Parrish's letter. 3 times asterisk she wrote. He has just informed me. He has apparently been keeping count. She sealed the letter. Outside, the December dark had settled over Ashford Estate, the grounds folding themselves into winter with the patient permanence of things that do not need the light to know where they are. The fire went on. The chairs held their arrangement. The library sat around them, chronologically organized and fully inhabited, smelling of old paper and wood smoke, and the specific warmth of a room that is used rather than kept. He had been warned that she would soften him. They had been right. He just never told anyone he hadn't minded at all. And she never told anyone, not Mrs. Parrish, not Mrs. Holt, not anyone, about the morning she had found, tucked beneath her teacup on an ordinary Tuesday in April with no occasion and no explanation, a single folded note in his handwriting. 3 words. Worth it all. She had put it in the locked drawer. He had never asked where it went. He already knew. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.